Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It is Monday, March 6th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. This week, I am going to have my first guest who's on for the third time, the one and only Dr. Jason Goldman. But before we jump into it, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Through the Patreon portal, I want to thank Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Mark Hepburn, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Christian Jeffrey, David Lacey. Yeah, you sent me an email about how to say your name, and now I can't find the email. We'll see how that goes. Jeffrey Perez, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Charles Payette, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. And through the PayPal portal, I want to thank Rob Schreck. Thank you so much for your generous support. Remember, it's because of you guys that I can keep Talk Nerdy going week after week. There's also other ways to support the show. I mean, the biggest one is to rate and review on iTunes and just tell your friends about it. Mention it on social media. The more people that come to the show and listen to it, the easier it is for me to get advertisers, and the better the Patreon goes. And so on and so forth. All right, I'm totally recording this in the middle of the night, so I am loopy. Why don't we just go ahead and dive right into the show? You know him, you love him. He's been on 2 times in the past. This is his third appearance. It's not really an appearance on a podcast, is it? But it is his third time on the show. He is one of my best friends. He is a brilliant and prolific science writer, among many other talents. Here he is, Dr. Jason Goldman. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining me. You are my first thirdsies.
Thirdsies?
Is this thirdsies for us?
This is the third time I'm on the show, if that's what you mean by thirdsies.
Yes, that's what I mean. I guess not to be confused with onesies and twosies, which have a different meaning.
I used some phrase earlier. I don't remember what it was. Third.
I think you said, well, you didn't say
thirdsies.
No, you wouldn't say
that.
thirdsies.
Is not in my lexicon.
I think you just said, am I your first third?
First third. That's
yes,
probably what I said.
You are my first third. I have had a couple of seconds on the show. I've had Tegan Wall on twice. I've had Neil Shubin on twice, but I'm not sure if that counts because it was more like a continuation of the first
like
interview.
Part 1 and Part 2?
Kind of, yeah. I've had Phil Plait on twice.
Wow.
But you're my first third.
I'm so honored.
Well, thanks. I always like it when we get to record in studio. I feel like there's a special magic to an episode that, not that I haven't, been honored to do some really great recordings with people who are remote. Wow. I love that the internet exists for that reason. But there is something to be said about being able to see each other, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure.
And to be able to share a pot of tea. I'm really into tea lately.
I know, because you stopped drinking soda.
That is why, yeah. So I just load my tea up with honey. It's almost as bad. So, okay. Yeah, you might hear some clinking sounds throughout the recording because there's a spoon in my...
Hopefully no slurping sounds.
Yeah, I'll try not to slurp.
No one wants to hear slurping.
No, I'm going to back away. I'm going to take a sip of my tea and back away. You're supposed to fill the dead air.
Well, I wanted to hear if I could hear it through my headphones. I definitely heard some, not slurping, but I heard some swallowing.
Shit. Okay, I'll try not to drink unless I have to. So I'm recording this on the new GarageBand because I got a new MacBook, which I'm obsessed with, but it's some things about it are kind of clunky. I do like the touch bar. That's the new thing to the MacBook Pro.
I mean, I don't have one yet, but I sort of assume I will not.
No, I think you might like it. It's cool for the native apps that it's enabled for. What I do love the touch bar. Look, it's actually got all these things
special
that I'm never going to use. Special buttons that say things like dynamics and compression and EQ, which I don't know what any of that means.
Like GarageBand specific.
Exactly, because it's a native Mac app. But what I don't like is that the trackpad is so big on the new one that when I'm typing, I find myself touching the trackpad with my thumb, and then my cursor will jump to somewhere else in the document, and it drives me fucking insane.
I use an external mouse when I'm at my desk.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you do that, if it will disable the trackpad.
I think you can disable your trackpad.
But I also have these, you know how back in the day, in the 90s, they would have those little foam, risers you'd put in front of your keyboard, for your wrist.
Oh yeah, because everybody had carpal tunnel.
Foam pads, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to put one of those in front of a laptop, right? But I have these little wrist things that you
Mhm.
like they're like gloves, but
Mm.
they have like little pads under your wrists, so they're
Oh.
attached to your hands instead of like in front of on the table.
So
So it
anywhere.
kind of raises,
That's nice.
and now I think it's weird to type without them.
I could see that. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it looks weird when you're in a
Oh, it
coffee
looks
shop
super
typing.
dorky.
But you're a writer. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
that's the
spend
thing.
all of my day at my computer
Yeah, you're
when I'm at
typing
home.
literally all day. Have you thought about moving to trying dictation or like text to speech, or is it just not? It's still is it still too
No,
clunky?
I don't know. I don't know that that's how I think. I like to. I don't know. It's a good question.
Mm.
Um, no, I've not tried that, and I've not thought about it.
I thought about doing it for I'm doing a story collider event coming up soon, which is like a live storytelling event, and then they record them and put them on their podcast. And I'm excited but like scared shitless. And I thought about maybe doing dictation for my story because I was having a hard time writing it and not knowing what to say. Maybe if I just talked, but there's something so unstructured about that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that works for maybe if you're not writing nonfiction. I don't know. Like so much of what I'm writing about is like based on research, and I'm looking at my papers and PDFs, and I'm listening to recordings of like my interviews, and I'm not sure. Like switching modalities between like speech and like uh, you know whatever the non-speech version of writing is, like
Written language,
like like
spoken language versus
I
written
don't know
language.
if it's quite a modality shift, but
I think
it's
it is. It requires like a big attentional shift.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
like
I
whatever
agree.
is like to have my like auditory working memory taken by the words I'm writing as opposed to like whatever ideas I have in my
Hmm.
mind, or perhaps the interview I'm listening to.
Mm.
I don't know.
Okay, so
I might be overthinking this.
this is spoken like a true psychologist, and I had a question for you because I don't know if I've ever asked you this. This is so funny because you guys have no context. If you haven't listened to my first and second episode with Jason, you're like, "What the fuck is going on?" But Jason, dear friend of mine, prolific science writer. Oh, it sounds like
Is that your doorbell?
that was my doorbell. It was actually the motion sensor because Killer,
Oh.
my boyfriend was working out in the garage, so he just came in, and Killer came in to greet us. Hi, sweetie. Look how excited he is. Look at his little tail.
Probably 'cause it was cold outside.
It was cold outside. Hi, little man. Hey, okay. No, you don't want to hang out with me anymore? Aw, thanks. So just as a little bit of background, Jason, who's been on the show a lot, you should definitely listen to those episodes. You are a dear friend of mine, member of the quote unquote nerd brigade, which is like a group of our LA based nerdy friends who hang out and do nerdy things, most of which are science communicators or scientists. You have a PhD from USC in cognitive science.
Developmental psychology, but I
Developmental
studied animal
psychology.
cognition. Yeah,
So you study cognition underneath,
cognitive development.
yeah, underneath the banner of developmental psych. So you have a PhD. You're a psychologist. So you have a research psychology degree.
Yes, yes, I do.
Sorry, we're having technical difficulties, which you can't tell because I just edited them very smoothly.
Hopefully.
We'll see. Yeah. So anyway, but most of what you do now as a career, you're a freelance writer. The vast majority of the income that you earn comes from writing, doing reporting, some speaking.
Yeah, writing some podcasts.
Yeah, some podcasts, things like that. But you write an awful lot, and you write for a lot of really respected outlets. You write for Scientific American, for BBC Future. Is it BBC Future?
I write for BBC Future and BBC Earth.
And BBC
yes.
Earth. You've previously written for Earth Touch. You've written for Biographic.
Biographic, yes.
Biographic is beautiful, guys, if you haven't
it's
seen it.
really well produced.
Yeah, it's like
impressive.
A stunning kind of online magazine with gorgeous images, and it's very multimedia, like a multimedia approach to storytelling, which I like.
And it's really nice to see an outlet like that puts effort into like photography.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. I mean, it's a biodiversity focused magazine. It makes sense because wildlife photography is I think maybe not necessary if you're telling wildlife stories, but it
helps, yeah.
Certainly critical, certainly important.
It's cool too because you are also into photography, you're a very good photographer, and you've been taking more and more images. But generally speaking, your kind of beat, if I could pick something where I feel like the majority of your work falls under urban wildlife.
Yeah. I mean, I usually say that I cover wildlife, ecology, and conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, I have an interest in urban wildlife.
Is that because you are an urban dweller?
Well, yes. I mean, at least in part. I have an interest in our local LA wildlife, which is certainly urban wildlife. But if there's if there are themes that run through my work, I think one of them is that nature is not in a place that's far away. Like you don't have to drive to nature. Nature is in your backyard, right?
Mhm.
Nature is on your balcony. Um, Nature is on like the freeway median.
Yeah.
Um, so urban wild, stories about urban wildlife obviously lend themselves um, to communicating that idea.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess my roundabout question is, do you consider yourself a psychologist because you're trained as a psychologist? Because it feels obviously like it informs your work so much, but it feels very, in many ways, separate from what you do
Um,
now.
that's a really good question. I mean, I am right in that that's what my degree is in.
Yeah, you earned the title. You earned
Right.
the right to be called that.
But like in practice, if like from a practical perspective, you tell someone you're a psychologist that means something to them. That the first thing I think of is not, oh, well, you probably did research with chickens, right?
That's
Like,
true. A lot of times they think
um,
you must be a
right, like
clinician.
that's not my career.
Mhm.
Like I have that background, certainly that scientific background, but these days I call myself a science journalist.
Yeah, science journalist. And so beyond the first thought people having is that you were a clinician when you say you're a psychologist. It's like beyond the fact that they don't I think it's not typical that people think of psychology as a research
Right.
oriented degree. You're also not actively doing psychological research anymore.
No, no, and for that matter, I mean, I suppose I do cover psychology from time to time, and I certainly like to cover the intersection of psychology and like conservation.
Mhm.
Um, but that's certainly not the bulk. Like my interests have shifted. Even when I was doing research, I was studying animals.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true.
Animals as a model for people. But
And you were
also,
looking at like theory of mind and things like that.
the sort of origins of the mind.
Okay.
Um, the sort of building blocks of cognition. But very little, I would say, of like what I do now on a day to day basis is strictly psychology. Like you might think that my scientific background was like ecology or evolutionary biology or
Mhm.
something.
Yeah. And I think that's cool when it comes to science journalism. I think I've seen a lot of science journalists, either they were trained in the sciences or they were trained in journalism, but they probably focused on something so wildly different than the niche that they found later in life. And
Yeah,
what a great opportunity because it means you get to learn a whole new kind of craft all over again.
yeah, and I mean, like I can look back, I think, and trace like the pathway that got me here. Like I do think there are some logical connections.
Mhm.
Um, but frankly, to be a science journalist, I mean, you don't need to have a scientific background to be a science journalist. So there's certainly no reason you couldn't, develop an expertise in one area of science that is not the one in which you trained.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Why do you think that science is so like fundamentally appealing to a certain sect of the population and so incredibly, I don't know, scary or boring? Or I mean, obviously it's because people don't really know what science is, and that I think contributes to the turnoff. But I've been thinking about this more and more lately. Like I surround myself with scientifically minded people and people who really enjoy science. My podcast mainly focuses on science, so my listenership is already interested in that, right? Like you guys like it when I talk about science. I think you like the politics and the atheism and the feminism and the other stuff that I care about, but you come to talk nerdy for a reason. What is it about us, do you think, that makes us really like it?
We're
And
weird, man.
you right?
No, I mean,
Like
I don't actually think we're weird.
we're
Um,
nerdy, definitely.
I, I mean, I don't actually know the answer to that
I know
question.
it's a tough one.
Um, I I think everyone starts out like that, right? I
Mhm.
mean, what does it mean to be a scientist or to be interested in science if not simply to be innately curious about the world?
Yeah.
And like not just to have that curiosity, but then to actually have the drive and motivation to follow it, like
Mhm.
to find answers to these questions you have about the world. And like kids generally have that, right? Even frankly, adults have that. They just might not think they might not realize that the questions they're asking about the world can be answered by science.
Mhm. Or that
Um,
they're doing science when they do science,
right
you
when they
know?
when they try to solve problems and
Yeah.
figure out the answers to their questions. Um,
So do you think a lot of it's just labeling?
I think some of it is probably labeling. I think some of it is jargon tends to distance people, right? It tends to, if you're not comfortable with certain vocabulary, I
Mm.
think it can be othering. Um, Frankly, I think scientists sometimes do some of that othering themselves. Like I
Yeah.
think sometimes we do a bad job of being as inviting to people who don't speak our language as we could. I mean,
Yeah.
this is certainly, as a science communicator, I hope I don't do that, but I think as a field we can
Yeah. We
be
definitely have room for improvement. I mean, I think that's in not the only reason, but one of many reasons that science communication as a field actually came to be,
right.
is to help translate when there has been, I think, historically a bit of an ivory tower kind of, I don't know, cut off.
Right, right. And frankly, I think part of it probably has to do with the way we teach science in schools.
Yeah.
Um, I did not enjoy my science classes in high school.
I didn't
Frankly.
either. It's scary. I mean,
So,
it was scary, and like the tie of math to science was always like a bit
yeah.
overwhelming for me. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
what's when you were in high school? So you studied school here in Los
yeah.
Angeles. What science class? There are so many helicopters tonight. I don't know if you can hear them. I
uh,
feel like I can. I
I
can't
hear
tell if I'm picking it up on the
yeah,
mic
that's what I
or
was gonna
just
say.
yeah. So we'll see. If not,
Um,
we just sound like crazy people being surrounded by helicopters. LA is weird. What science classes did you take in high school?
let me see. In ninth grade I took biology.
Mm-hmm.
And even like it was really like cell biology, I think primarily.
Yeah.
There was probably like a chapter or something on evolution, like a unit. I think if it had been like zoology, or evolutionary biology, or something like that, it might have attracted me more.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 10th grade I took chemistry. And frankly, I don't remember much. That
Yeah.
was that was the year I studied abroad half the year. So
Oh, cool. Where were you?
I lived in Tel Aviv the
Oh,
second
that's
semester of
awesome.
my sophomore year on exchange program. And of those, there were 22 of us, I think, from my high school who were all together, and there
Mm-hmm.
were like 3 of us who were in chemistry. And they put us in a chemistry class when we were in Israel in Tel Aviv, with a teacher whose like English was like okay.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure we spent most of that semester just burning magnesium strips. um,
Well,
I probably did not learn as much chemistry on my exchange program as I would have had I stayed home.
my high school, just to interject, my high school chemistry class was equally actually it was I don't know. I'm not trying to compete here or anything, but I was an international baccalaureate student, which is basically like forced AP in every class you take. But in order to not completely kill you, you get to choose like 3 classes, or maybe it's only like 1 class. It's not AP
Oh,
level.
interesting.
And I was so scared of chemistry that I took regulars chemistry in high school. And it was the most ludicrous. I don't remember learning any chemistry. I remember doing a chemistry rap with my lab partners. I remember, and we did we sang TLC's Red Light Special and changed the lyrics to chemical reaction. It was ridiculous. And then we did a Juvenile song, and I don't remember the lyrics, but there's something about Bill Nye on cable and catching my weave on fire. Like I definitely remember that. And then we had to make chemistry greeting cards. That's literally all I don't remember anything about
Interesting.
learning
I mean,
chemistry.
there must have been something.
There
right?
must have been,
I just
right?
we just don't remember it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then and that was, by the way, not AP chemistry. That was like chemistry honors or something.
Yeah.
And then I took AP physics for 2 years, AP physics B and AP physics
Oh, you did?
C. Yeah,
I didn't take high school physics at all.
yeah. I don't remember if it was a UC requirement. Like my high school's curriculum was essentially built to fulfill all the UC, all the
Mhm.
University of California
Yeah.
requirements. I think it just required 3 years of science. I don't think it had to be physics necessarily. But I thought I was a smart kid. I wanted to take hard classes.
Yeah.
Physics was somehow, at least like that level of physics, which was like basically mechanics and optics,
Mhm.
really. And
Like Newtonian, kind of
yeah,
classical.
classical, yeah.
Yeah.
AP Physics C sort of it started to incorporate like the calculus,
Mhm.
which I was taking AP Calculus that year.
Well, that's
Um,
good. So it wasn't.
yeah,
Did you
but
enjoy it, or was it like,
I think
ugh?
physics was a little more intuitive to me than chemistry was.
Gotcha.
I certainly it's certainly no longer the case.
So you really found biology in college.
Yeah, I mean, it was circuitous pathway. I eventually landed in psychology, in psychology department. I was a psychology major. Um, and sort of, through those classes, as I think how I became interested in evolutionary biology, because we'd be learning these things. I'd be like, well, where did they come from?
Mm.
Um, I actually took a class in the religion department. I was briefly considering like a Jewish studies minor,
Mhm.
and I took some classes, and eventually I realized I had enough for like the religion minor. So
Yeah.
I do have a religion minor,
That's cool.
um, which is a thing that I think most people probably don't know. Um, but I took a class, and it still kind of blows my mind that this was taught in a religion department. But it was called Evolution, Free Will, and the Problem of the Soul.
Oh, that's cool.
And it was the professor. He's now I think at University of British Columbia. His name was Edward Slingerland. Um, and I mean he was I think it was his last year at USC before he moved, and I think this was like his dream class that he finally got the chance to teach. Um, and like it was in a religion department where I was first exposed to like Dan Dennett and Richard Dawkins and Robin Dunbar. Like we read Selfish Gene for that class, and we read Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Dan Dennett's book.
That's
Um,
so progressive.
and it was in a religion department.
That's amazing.
Um,
So, I mean, yeah, you would think philosophy.
right. Like this is where I learned about like exaptations and how adaptation works and sky hooks and all these ideas.
What's a skyhook?
It was one of the like
I was like, what?
it was one of the ideas. I think it was in Darwin's Dangerous Idea. One of the like the ideas that he used to describe how like natural selection does not work. Like you cannot jump from point A to point C without traveling all the intermediate steps.
I see.
You cannot be lifted up with a sky
Like a
hook
crane.
and
Gotcha.
then drop somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's reaching far back. I hope I got that right.
Well,
It makes sense, right?
that's how it makes sense in your mind.
Yeah.
So obviously you took something from the class.
Yeah. So like, but I was taking these psychology classes and I had taken this class, and that's kind of what I was like. I wanted to know where these things came from. And then eventually, once I started grad school, eventually I became interested in, if you want to know where these things came from, you have to understand a little bit about animals.
Yeah.
And if you want to understand animal behavior, animal cognition, which is what I was studying, I started to realize that there was at least it seemed to me as a graduate student, that there were all these people using all these animals mainly as models, in the psychology literature and the cognitive science literature, but without any real attention paid to the ecology of these animals.
So they're just plucked out of their environments and
Right,
dropped into a
Right.
lab.
Which maybe on some level makes sense if you're looking at like highly inbred laboratory mice.
Sure. And if you're looking specifically at like, I don't know, a disease state,
right.
pathology, something, or pain adaptation, or even
Right.
that.
Even that, I think you need some ecology.
You're
But
right.
certainly, if you want to know something about the evolution of behavior
Mhm.
and cognition, you need to understand something about the environment in which that mind evolved. And I think like primatologists, those people who study like chimpanzee behavior, rhesus monkeys, are a little bit better about this, about
Yeah,
understanding the
because
ecology.
I think probably the harder the animal is to keep in the lab, the more
Sure, you have to
likely
go to
they
the
are to
field.
understand why it's important to do field research.
Yeah.
I've been
or
reading.
at least understand something about like the social, right? Like you can't ask a question about the social cognition of a chimpanzee without understanding something about their social ecology.
Yeah, you absolutely can't.
Um,
Yeah, because you have to know and it does seem like the quote unquote higher order the organism is, which is kind of an unfair thing to say. The more each individual has a personality, and the
Right.
more, but like all animals have personalities.
yeah.
Like a mouse has a personality, and so maybe if you're trying to look at
crabs.
hermit crab, you're trying to look at one mouse, and you're like, why is he so shy? Maybe he's a shy
Right,
mouse.
right.
Like it's not just fundamental mouse behavior.
Yeah.
I've been reading Franz de Waal's The Bonobo and the Atheist.
I haven't read that
And
one yet. He's a great writer.
This is my first Franz de Waal book.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I don't know why this is the one I picked, but he's written a bunch of books, and many of which about all of them mostly about primates, but many of which about bonobos.
He's a chimpanzee bonobo researcher.
Yeah, and he really does have that kind of understanding that these are individual creatures and they are products of evolution, absolutely, but just like us,
They're also products of their environment.
Yeah, they're products of the environment, and they have personalities.
Yep.
They have personas. I know that person sounds human, but we are just one of the 5 great apes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not that different from chimps
No,
and bonobos.
I think we share chimpanzees 97.3%.
It's something crazy. It's
Yeah.
definitely high. And when I look at bonobos, they look like creepily human to me.
Yeah.
Bonobos even more than chimps.
Yeah, we share a tiny bit more with
More.
bonobos
Yeah.
than
I think it's too
chimpanzees.
because their faces are like really hairless.
Yeah.
And so they look superhuman. Not superhuman, but really
Really
human.
human.
Yeah. I do like every time I have guests on, I like to talk about their path because I think it's important, especially when people listening are figuring out their own paths. And lots of times I think we have this idea in our heads that we have to know exactly what we want and we have to brick by brick lay the pathway for it. But it's so calm. I don't know if anybody just goes, I'm gonna be a doctor.
Right.
Like
I
when they're
mean,
12.
some people
and
must,
they must, but God, how boring.
but like how many of them end up actually becoming doctors?
That's what I'm saying.
And how
yeah.
many doctors did start out that way? You know,
and
probably.
like and then they just that's their whole story. I
Yeah.
said I was gonna be a doctor. I did everything I needed to do to become a doctor. Now I'm a doctor.
Right, which is great.
I guess.
That certainly wasn't my story.
I don't know. It's certainly not a common story.
Yeah.
And when people are trying to decide what their major should be when they start college and they're like, I haven't declared yet and I'm already, the end of my freshman
who
year. It's like,
cares?
who cares? Add up all the classes you've taken and see which
Right.
ones are like what are the most you've taken in the same field?
Yeah.
That's probably what you should study.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed it, and even if that's not what you end up studying, there's so many careers out there where you could have studied something separate, something different. So I like to hear the individual story. When I think about the work that you do, and I read a lot of the articles that you read, it's like one of my favorite things when I'm going through my feed reader each week to pick out stories that I want to tweet in Facebook, and I see your byline. I love it when I see my friends' bylines.
Like when you didn't set out looking for pieces. By your
Yeah,
friends,
when I'm
but-
just going through my feed reader
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh, Jason wrote a new article about blah, like, oh, that's so great.
That's
or-
what most of my articles are about.
Blah. Yeah. He's a really good blah writer. That's so terrible. No, about all the things that you write about. But some of the things you've been really focusing on lately have been like big deal ecology and conservation issues. Yeah, conservation's been heavy. And conservation is a tough one, right? Because it's depressing.
Yeah.
And so your task, how do you write about animals that are going bye-bye
It's a good question.
and not make people depressed?
Well, I don't know how to not make people depressed. I try to not become myself depressed.
Oh yeah, right
Um,
there. You've got to do that so that
right.
you don't give it up. I've heard that about like aid workers that there's
interesting.
yeah, it's a difficult, especially not especially, but I remember reading a specific article about people who work like in animal rescue and things
Yeah.
like that, and like burnout is really terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been lately sort of looking at some of these basically ways in which we're mistreating wildlife.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of journalists get into this because they want to stand up for the little guy.
Mhm.
There's something that Brian Christie talks about, like standing up for the little guy, giving the little guy a voice. There is no littler guy than wildlife and animals.
And they're like dying at an incredible rate right now.
Yeah.
Like we really, in so many ways, are in a sixth extinction.
Yeah. And a lot of that is frankly our fault.
Mm-hmm.
So how to not be depressed about it? In part, I think, telling people cool stories about the world around them, is inspiring. And when you do get into the depressing things, I think certainly for me, and I hope it comes through in the stories,
Mm-hmm.
is that yes, things look bad. I don't think it's right to deny that, but there are really clever people working on really brilliant solutions
Mm-hmm.
to these problems. And a lot of times, like there's a lot of problems in the world, right? And animals might fall lower on the list than people. And perhaps that's reasonable. But the more people can understand that solving animal problems solves people problems, and I believe the reverse is also true. Solving people problems solves wildlife problems.
Mm-hmm.
Then and we can see like glimmers of progress on these things, or at least dedicated people trying to make progress. I think there's hope there.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to talk about this really interesting story that you have written, that you wrote recently about poaching. But before we get into it, I'm reminded of, and sorry to throw you a curveball, but I know that you have a lot to say about this. So, I was at the gym yesterday, and my trainer mentioned the LA Zoo. He's had a membership for 4 or 5 years, and takes his kids there. He has two young children, and I have a membership to the LA Zoo. You have a membership. We've gone together. I love it. But he was talking about how he brings his kids to the zoo now because he wants them to be exposed to the animals and to have an appreciation for the animals. But once they get older, he won't bring them anymore because he has a real issue with the institution of the zoo. Not our zoo,
Uh-huh.
but a zoo as
Zoos
a
in
whole.
general.
Yeah. And I kind of countered him a little. I said, I understand your reservations, obviously, because historically, zoos were like circuses.
Yeah.
Historically, zoos were like for entertainment, not education. But I was like, you do realize that there are, even at our zoo in LA, like in the herpetology area, there are species that don't exist in the wild anymore. Like if we didn't have zoos, those things would be gone. So I was trying to kind of get across that it's not a black and white issue,
Yeah,
but
certainly.
I know that you probably have some more insight about that because you care passionately about zoos,
Yeah.
but also I'm
About
sure you take issue with certain aspects of zoos.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I good, ethical, accredited zoos, I think, often do good work, and have an important,
Do you think they're necessary?
I think necessary.
Mm,
I would love to live in a world in which a zoo wasn't necessary.
yeah.
I don't know that they are, but I know that like they're not necessary.
I'm
um,
that really
I don't
clarifies
know.
things for me.
I don't know that zoos are necessary. I do think that holding captive populations of animals has value right now.
I see. So you don't know
Um,
how much the outward facing, public facing portion of it is necessary, but the research and the curation of
yeah, I mean,
threatened species is
yeah,
necessary.
and I don't know that that's as sophisticated an answer to that question as I'd like to give.
Hmm. That's
Um,
fair.
but yeah, so I mean, I like I said, I do support ethical accredited zoos, not
Mm.
these sideshows, roadside attractions, whatever.
Yeah, that's not a zoo.
Um,
But there are some zoos, and I'm not pointing out any names because I don't know. I haven't done my research on this. I'm sure there are some zoos that do zooing much
Better.
better.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, like anything, there's better and worse examples. But in general, I think people debate the educational value of zoos, and I think
Hmm.
there's probably some room for debate. I think some, like any other, like if you go to Natural History Museum, some exhibits are really well done, and some of them are a little bit less well done.
Yeah.
Um, but zoos, I think, certainly play an important role in research and conservation. And
Mm.
certainly, at least, here in the U.S. and certainly in Europe and many other places, uh, zoos, have their own mandates to support in situ conservation work. Conservation work on the ground, as much as conservation work that's ex situ. In the zoo.
Yeah.
Um,
So not only is a zoo going to have their captive primate population, but they might be sending money or sending researchers to
right,
preserve.
to the field,
Yeah.
to work on
To
these
like the
problems.
DRC where they're
Yeah.
actively studying,
Yeah.
bonobos or something.
Yeah, so if a zoo has a really impressive bonobo exhibit, you can almost be sure that
Hmm.
they are devoting resources also to work in the field. And there are good, reasonable criticisms about how those resources are allocated. They're often allocated towards the more charismatic species, right? Perhaps
Lions and
Right.
apes and
Perhaps not the
elephants.
species who, to ask which species needs help more than the other, is a question of, it's a values question, perhaps,
Yeah.
more than a straightforward scientific question. But there are criticisms that can be made. But at the end
Sure.
of the day, it is not. I do not think you can question the notion that there are species that exist in the wild today that would not, if not for zoos.
Yeah. And there are
Um,
absolutely species that no longer exist in the wild and that only exist in zoos.
yeah, probably, yeah.
And if we didn't have zoos, they would not exist at
Right.
all.
So certainly, they're like functionally extinct in the wild. They're not providing their sort of ecological role anymore
Hmm.
in that case. But like the Kahansi spray toad, which is this highly endemic toad that like Now I wish I knew where they were from. Southern Africa somewhere.
I'll look it up.
Um,
How do you spell Inhansi?
Kihansi,
Kehansi.
Kihansi.
Okay.
Like they're adapted to live like on these damp rocks along waterfalls, along certain rivers.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the habitat. That's their niche, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there was,
Tanzania.
Tanzania. Okay, so Southern Africa. I was not
uh,
crazy. Um, and I think they were losing their habitat because some of the rivers started to be dammed. And without like the spray that
yeah.
were keeping these like microhabitats right for them, they were losing habitat. It is explicitly because of the Bronx Zoo and I believe the Denver Zoo,
Mm-hmm.
certainly Bronx, that they still exist in the wild. Like these researchers went up, they rounded up the last few they could find. They had a captive breeding program. They've been reintroducing them back into the wild now that there's some habitat restoration going on. Like this species would not exist but for the work of zoos.
Yeah.
And we can say the same thing about black-footed ferrets here in the U.S. To some extent about Przewalski horses. There's a sort of the California condors would not, I believe, exist in the wild, but for the L.A. and San Diego zoos. We tend to try out the same examples over and over again because conservation successes, frankly, are not as easy to come by.
Well, it's complicated, right? Like
Yeah.
ecology is complicated. It's probably one of the most complicated systems we can imagine. You think of the human body, for example, as a closed system, and a doctor's job, a physician's job, is to understand how all of these different organ systems interact and the cellular systems interact. And, you have a heightened level of one chemical in your blood, and how does that affect this organ, and how does it affect this other chemical? And that's really
Yeah.
complicated as it is, right?
That's
But it's all
ecology.
within one human body.
Yeah.
Now extend that to the entire
Right,
planet.
or to an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Carl Zimmer. He once gave a talk and turned it into a piece called The Human Lake. I think
Hmm.
that's what it's called. And he sort of drew this parallel, like that, in a sense, we're all ecologists. No matter what kind of science you do, at least in the life sciences, we're all ecologists.
I like that. Yeah. All right, guys, I want to take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of this week's episode. All right, guys, let's get back to the show. So you've been focusing lately on interesting stories about conservation, and specifically some of your stories have had the obvious human intervention angle, and sometimes it's about habitat lost, it's about deforestation, sometimes it's about more nefarious human intervention like poaching.
Yeah.
One story that comes to mind for me, because I think it's a super interesting and creative approach to poaching, is the story that you told recently about these turtles in Nicaragua.
Yeah. Yeah, so this was a piece. There were two pieces actually in Good Magazine. One in like the fall 2017 print, 2016.
That would
What year
be
are
yeah,
we?
that would make
Fall
sense.
2016,
Fall
or
2017
maybe it
hasn't
was
happened
maybe it
yet.
was winter 27, whatever it was.
Mm.
Um, there was like a print piece, and then there was an online piece
Mm.
in Good Magazine, and this is a story. So Olive Ridley, there's what, 7 kinds of sea turtles. They're like all endangered.
Oh,
Um,
I didn't know that.
like
That is sad.
various levels of endangerment. Um, the Olive Ridley sea turtle is pretty unique because they to reproduce, they obviously they lay eggs like like turtles do, but there are 7 beaches in the world where these turtles come by the thousands, tens of thousands, all on the same nights, around the new and full moons
That's it. Only 7
to lay their
beaches.
eggs. Yeah, so there are more. So there are some solitary nesting olive ridley turtles which will nest on other beaches as well. But this mass egg laying event, which in South America is called the arribada, like the arrival,
Mm.
happens on 7 beaches.
That must be incredible to
Um,
see.
yeah, let me think if I can remember where they all are. It's
Oh God, that's a
ugh,
that's a
t-
terrible test. We don't
two
have.
in Mexico,
Okay.
one in Costa Rica, one in Nicaragua, or maybe 2 in Costa Rica. There's one in Africa somewhere.
So it's equatorial, but it's not necessarily just North American,
No, yeah,
or I should say
Olive Ridley's are
American.
distributed.
Why did I say North American?
I don't know.
South and Central America.
Olive Ridley's are distributed across the world.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, like, yes, there are solitary nesters who nest on other beaches, but the species as a whole relies on these 7 beaches. And
Yeah.
imagine what happens if you lose 1 or 2 or 3 of them, right? Um, so these sea turtles, come up by the thousands, and each female lays, like 120 eggs.
So this is one of those species where, because they don't care for their young, they produce way more young than they think will survive.
Yeah. So, like, uh, in a world without humans, perhaps like 1% of them will survive to reproductive age and come back and lay their eggs on that beach,
Mm.
um, or reproduce, and then their partner will come back and lay those eggs on that beach. Um, so there's this like influx of frankly nutrients onto this beach, right? All these eggs, and you've got lots of animals that have evolved to rely on this for their nutrition, which is fine, right? That's
Sure,
how
that's totally
wildlife
normal.
goes.
No humans around. That's
Um,
going to happen regardless.
right. So, but because humans are the worst. Um, we like to poach these eggs. We like to take these eggs and eat them. And historically, human cultures in parts of the world where turtles lay their eggs have harvested some sea turtle eggs, and that's also like if it's done sustainably, it's also probably okay. I think
Yeah,
it's
and a
okay.
small indigenous group of
Right.
individuals who have hundreds of years of culture backing that up.
Right. But now there's this black market for sea turtle eggs where they get swiped from the beach, and they wind up, many of them, in China.
So that's because they have magical powers?
Yeah, better boners.
Yeah. Oh, God.
I think there's also a belief, although I don't think it's in China. I believe it's believed locally, or historically it was believed that if you were a woman and you ate a turtle egg, you'd be more likely to have a boy,
Oh, yeah.
something like that.
There's that global
Um,
sexism.
Yeah. So, like, once the harvest of eggs becomes like commodified in that way, like it's not just for subsistence,
Mm.
um, then it is trivial, right? You've got thousands of eggs coming onto thousands of turtles coming and laying like tens of thousands of eggs, hundreds of thousands of eggs on a single beach, over several nights. And if you are an impoverished, Nicaraguan, let's say, you can make a few bucks going with a basket and scooping up hundreds, thousands of these eggs in a night.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because they're defenseless. They're just lying there.
right. Um, then it's a way to make a quick buck, certainly. Um, and there's this mismatch because a local in Nicaragua in particular, on this one beach we were on, in La Flora Wildlife Reserve, um, Playa La Flor. A local can get maybe $1 to $3 for a dozen eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And then in China, they end up being sold for like a single egg can go for up to $300.
Yeah.
And so it's relatively trivial to like arrest poachers on the ground, the people scooping up the eggs. But then, tomorrow they'll be replaced with 12 more just like them.
It's kind of like when we look at drug policy.
Any
the same
other
thing.
form of trafficking of anything,
Yeah,
right?
you're right. Any form of trafficking. It's the people at the top and it's the demand on the ground,
Right,
really,
right.
that you have to try and break up.
Right. So there's the demand end,
Mhm.
but then there's also the supply end.
Yeah.
And I think effective conservation will work on both. But we know that like the economics being what they are, and this is part of why I say if we solve people problems, we solve animal problems, and if we solve animal problems, we solve people problems. Because
Yeah.
these things are not, you cannot separate them. They're bound up with each other. So you can arrest these poachers, assuming that like the government is willing to put those resources into that,
Mhm.
into wildlife crime. But they will be replaced tomorrow with more people who are eager to make a few bucks.
Yeah.
What you really have to do is figure out how these eggs are moving out of the country, who the middlemen are, what the routes are, where they're going, how they're getting there.
And then who's buying them?
Right.
Yeah.
So we know where they start. We kind of know where they end up, but like the in between is something of a black box.
Mm-hmm.
So what these researchers, or what this nonprofit, an NGO called Paso Pacifico, which is based actually here in like Ojai,
Oh,
but does their work 100% in Nicaragua. In particular, so if you think about Nicaragua, right there in Central America, um,
we
like
haven't eaten yet, you guys. Like we're
Lake.
going to dinner
Well,
after
I'm going to
this.
Central Asia next week.
Oh, you're right, and
Um,
you're doing that.
so in the middle of the country is Lake Nicaragua,
Mm-hmm.
huge lake, and there's like a strip of land between Lake Nicaragua and the Pacific called the Paso del Istmo, and it's like isthmus, and this is where Paso Pacifico does most of their work. Um, and they came up with this plan to create these decoy eggs. Um, they're 3D printing um, fake turtle eggs, hiding GPS and Bluetooth chips inside of them, and working with a special effects artist here in Hollywood to get them to look something like a sea turtle egg.
Yeah.
And the idea is the reason why we were out there in November was the first field test. If we can drop these things into, the sea turtles are coming laying their eggs, they're dropping 100, 120, 80 of them at once. Um, and then if you drop in a couple of decoys, well, the poachers then come and swipe the decoys along with the real ones. Um, and then will the researchers be able to track the movement of this collection of eggs as it moves through the country, leaves the country, makes it somewhere else in the world. Um, so
That's genius.
right, like
Yeah.
I said, really clever
Mm-hmm.
ways of addressing some of these problems.
And even though it's like high tech, it's probably not overly
Incredibly
expensive.
cheap.
Yeah,
Like as
because
far as conservation goes.
we had this type of technology has been around for so long.
Right.
It's so democratized. Like it's very easy to do GPS tracking at this point.
Yeah, yeah.
Every new car has it. Every cell phone has it.
Yeah, I mean it's you know, in terms of like conservation triage, right? What problems should we solve first?
Mm-hmm.
And triage of general societal problems. Like I said, wildlife doesn't always come first, but if you can come up with a relatively low cost way of having high impact,
Yeah.
ideally, like a 3D printer is not cheap, but it's also not that expensive. Like all things considered.
It's much cheaper to 3D print something than to put in the effort to have like mass manufacturing
Right.
done.
And then, once the like special effects artist comes up with a like easily repeatable way
Yeah.
of getting them to look right, because a 3D printed egg does not look like a turtle egg.
Yeah.
Then it's a matter of like you put one in the Paso Pacifico office in Nicaragua, right? And you can make them there, and also pay people to do that work. And
And-
then you program the GPS chips. These eggs are basically glorified cell phones.
Yeah.
You
Little
track
beacons.
them just like you could a cell phone.
And it doesn't take that many. It's not like you have to mass produce this.
Right. I mean, certainly it would be good to make hundreds.
Yeah.
Um,
But even hundreds is not that many
Right,
in the grand
right,
scheme of
right.
things. Yeah.
yeah. So really, really, I think clever, cool idea.
Mhm.
Um,
And so I guess it's just a matter of time to see if it pans out the way
yeah.
that they
So
hope.
so that's why we were there in November to do the first field test.
Mhm.
Things did not go as planned.
When you were there.
Yeah, it was. So it was like the week leading up to Thanksgiving. I was actually there over Thanksgiving, which for those people listening who remember their natural disasters, was the week that a hurricane. I don't remember right now the name of the hurricane. But a hurricane slammed into the from the Caribbean side of
Mhm.
Central America. It was the latest hurricane in the season to hit that part of the world, I believe. And like the first time a hurricane had threatened Nicaragua in November since like the 70s, something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because it's warmer much later in the
Right,
year now.
right.
And earlier.
So there was a hurricane. We were on the Pacific coast, right? But Nicaragua is like a strip of land, like it's part
It's
of Central
tiny.
America,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there's a hurricane threatening from the east. In the end, it ended up veering a little bit south and really hit Panama.
Mhm. Yeah, Panama got pummeled.
And yeah, and Nicaragua it certainly had its share of damage, but a lot less bad than it could have been.
Mhm.
A lot better than it could have been. And then, uh, while the hurricane was still sort of looming, and we were, worried about what was going to happen, because we were in this part of this country. We were in this little town called El Nacional.
Mhm.
The sort of the nearest town that people have probably heard of is San Juan del Sur. And like, there's no infrastructure. Like the roads are made of dirt. There are no bridges. So like you're driving through this like creek, and that's fine. But if there's a hurricane and a storm surge, all
Yeah.
of a sudden it ain't like a little creek anymore. You can't drive through it. So,
And then you're
it was
trapped.
like, right, it was like, when are we gonna, like, at one point, do we think it's gonna get bad enough that we should probably drive up to Managua and get away from the coast
Mhm.
and not be able to, go out onto the beach at night and see if the turtles are there? Um, so like that was happening. But then on like day 3 or 4, um, we were like during the day, like the sea turtles come at night, right? So during the day we were looking at some other stuff, doing some other stuff, and they took me out to this monkey sanctuary they were building on the Costa Rican border, and there was no cell reception. There was no, we were like it was like an old bean farm, I think, that they're converting,
Mhm.
and we got back to the trucks and heard on the radio that there had been an earthquake off the coast, the Pacific coast, sort of at the Nicaragua El Salvador border, um, and with the earthquake came a tsunami advisory. um, So that's when we decided to get up to Managua, to the capital, sort of high ground in the middle of the
Yeah.
country. Um, the eggs left untested.
Do you think the turtles even came?
So they didn't come the nights we were there,
Yeah, I mean,
and
because with this kind of storm being bad enough to get the
right,
human researchers out, obviously these animals are going to be sensitive to
right,
changes in weather and tides and things
exactly.
like that.
So they didn't come the nights we were there, and they were
Yeah.
supposed to. Like you can, wildlife is inherently unpredictable, but you can predict a little bit if these
Hmm.
things are timed to like the lunar cycle, which they are. Um, So they didn't come when we were there. Like we found some solitary nesters, but
Sure.
not the aribata.
You found the ones that didn't get the message.
Right. The ones who prefer to lay their eggs alone and not with their friends.
Yeah.
Um. Uh. And so they were not, like, they were untested. And I ended up writing the piece about like the reality of field work. Like this is sometimes how it goes.
Which is so good because I think, especially lately, we've been seeing more and more problematic, or maybe we're just more sensitive to it. And so we've been able to point it out more, but problematic journalism in which individuals might report what they hoped would have
Oh,
happened instead of what actually happened, which is so terrible to do.
yeah,
And usually the story itself is so much more interesting,
yeah.
you know? Yes, we all wish things would go perfectly in
Yeah.
science, but they never
Yeah, I
do.
mean, and you don't tend to read stories about everything going wrong and like not having an answer to the question,
Yeah,
right?
but I
Like
feel
because at some point, like that's like an editor's gonna be like, well, we can't publish that story,
yeah, or like it's unsatisfactory to the reader,
right?
but a good
So
writer can still tell that story and tell it well, and then you're really tied up in
yeah,
the epic journey.
yeah, the danger, or at least
Yeah.
like the truth is, it probably wasn't that dangerous, but it was at least unknown what was
Mm.
gonna happen. We certainly acted with an overabundance of caution. For the first time ever, I always when I have contact information to give, I
Mhm.
always like leave my parents with like a phone number or whatever. I gave them the number of Pasta Pacifico's Managua office, and they've never used it, but they use it. They use it on this trip after not being able to get a hold of me because I was in this monkey sanctuary with no reception.
Yeah.
Um, so it was a little bit it was a tough trip. Um, and Kim, one of the biologists that I was down there with, she's based in, I believe, Michigan, but she was down there. By the time I got there, she'd already been there, I think, for 2 weeks, working on these eggs. Getting everything ready, figuring out how to program the GPS chips. She stayed another month almost. Um, like the last Aribata is basically in November.
Okay.
There's like sometimes like a mini Aribata in December. Um, and then they start up again in like May, April. Um, and the December Aribata never came either.
Really?
Um, and it's not clear why. It's not clear if like November was just so bad that the turtles were just like, screw this, and we'll try next year. Um, the fishermen were reporting that the water after the hurricane, and I mean the hurricane never quite hit where we were, but certainly lots
Mm.
of rain did and wind. Um, and they were reporting that the water was a lot murkier,
Hmm.
and the sea turtles is sort of like clear water.
Yeah.
So it's possible that they were just like, after that they were just like, screw this place, and essentially they'll be back next year.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely is that butterfly effect thing, right? That we don't often think about, but like these small changes
Yeah,
that can occur because we're not just talking about human effects via poaching, but we're also talking about human climate effects, and we're talking about all of these different ways that the ecological balance is kind of shifted. I don't know if balance is a good word because it kind of puts a value judgment on things, but generally speaking, there is sort of a way that nature does its
Yeah,
thing.
there's a predictable pattern, perhaps.
Predictable pattern, sure. There's a bit of a homeostatic kind of
Yeah.
situation, and when you fuck it up, a lot of things change.
Right. Yeah, and maybe that's in a short term, like hurricanes happen.
You're gonna say it right. You're gonna say life finds a way.
That's not where I was going, but it does. But it does. But like, here's the crazy thing. We were talking a little bit about like how you avoid getting depressed.
Yeah.
Like people who work in conservation are like pathologically optimistic. Like this woman Kim, she was there for like 6-8 weeks, right? Like when I got there, she was on crutches because she'd like hurt her ankle. So we were like out there walking around beaches. She was on crutches, right? Like I flew home 2 days early because of the threat of a hurricane, and she was hobbling around at the beach on crutches.
Yeah.
Like, I come back with some awesome stories, and maybe being a wildlife reporter, you have to be a little bit more badass than other people. But I am nothing like
like
some
the
of
actual
these researchers.
conservationist.
And afterwards, like we held the peace for until like the print deadline, as long as we could, to see if she was able to test the eggs in December, and she eventually wasn't. But like I tried to get her to basically tell me how upset that made her, to get some of those good quotes, and she was obviously upset about it. But like she like found the silver lining. She was like, well, look, at least I was able to program these eggs and drive them around and see how like they responded in that environment, because she'd only first tried to figure out how they work in Michigan, like where we have 4G.
Yeah.
And she was like, and it seems like they'll probably transmit reasonably well under local conditions. And I was like, great, like that is
You're like,
useful knowledge.
Wonderful, but are you sad?
Right, and like that, but like that is useful knowledge.
Absolutely, it's true.
And in May probably she'll go back and try again.
You think you'll go back? You think you'll want to try and?
Well, I'm dying to see an Aribata. Like
Yeah.
it's like it's a wonder of the world, right? Thousands of sea turtles laying
It'd
their
be
eggs at night.
incredible.
Like in a place where you can like see the stars, like we could see the Milky Way. It's actually also really cool. The sea turtles, they get some algae, like they get algae on their carapaces, right? And sometimes algae bioluminesces. And
neat.
so like if people see a nesting sea turtle, please don't touch it. Unless you know what you're doing, or you're people who know what they're doing. But you can like rub their carapace, and because the algae gets a little bit perturbed, and like there's some plankton in there and stuff, obviously, because they just come out of the water, and it bioluminesces. It's so cool.
So you've got these
glowing
turtles
laying their eggs under the Milky Way.
Yeah.
On
That's
this like remote beach.
See.
Yeah. So I'd like to go back.
So instead of reporting that she was sad, you could say how you were sad that you didn't get to see it.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and it just goes to show how innovative conservation is kind of in the modern age.
Right. And how it's forced to be.
Yeah, how a lot of these difficult problems that we in many ways are creating require innovative solutions that we can implement. So we've got to keep doing it. We've got to thank people like you who keep reporting on it, so that we know what is out there and what's happening, and so that we don't get depressed, because I think you're right. Like the best way to not get overwhelmed with a lot of the troubles of the world right now is to stay solution oriented.
Right. And to focus on the people. Like this, I mean, this is something that Mr. Rogers used to talk about, right? It's like when something bad is happening, look for the helpers.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like these are the helpers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And figure out ways that you can be a helper too, because there's so much cool citizen science going on out there, and there's a lot of opportunity for individuals who are interested in helping. Even just I know it sounds trite, but like monetarily, after the election, I was really overwhelmed, and I decided that I needed to make a lot more financial donations than I had historically. And I picked, Planned Parenthood and ACLU and things like that. But I even came to you and said, who should I go with for wildlife? I don't really want to go with Greenpeace because I don't like their history of GMOs, and I don't know, is Sierra Club the right way to go? And you recommended Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm really glad I went with them. I get their updates,
Yeah.
and I'm really proud of the work that they do. And knowing that I could have, in my very minimal way, helped support that, I feel like I'm sort of in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Well, Jason, there's so much more I want to talk to you about, which means you're going to have to come back for foursies. But right now, we are. If we don't tie up the interview, we're going to be late for our dinner reservation with all of our friends. I'm not going to close with the final two questions because we've done it a few times, and
Yeah.
we'll do it again the next time. But is there anything else that we didn't? Oh my gosh, we didn't talk about this really cool new thing that you're doing with our friend Phil Torres.
Yeah.
Why don't you let everybody know about these awesome science vacations?
Yeah. So Phil and I, have partnered with Atlas Obscura. Phil, like me, also, goes to really cool places in the field and looks for wild animals and comes back and tells stories about them.
Mm-hmm.
And we tell our friends about these things that we see, and often the first question we get is, well, how do I go? I want to go. And sometimes the answer is, frankly, you can't. But often the answer is you can. There's a lot of really good, solid ecotourism happening, and I part of the problem with ecotourism is that it's not always easy to figure out who is telling you the truth.
And who's legitimate? Yeah.
Right, like which tourism operations really are ecotourism and which are nature tourism, perhaps masquerading as ecotourism.
So what's the difference?
So ecotourism usually, or I mean, there's no like governing body that determines something is ecotourism or not. But in general, you find that they are minimal impact.
Okay.
They flow the economics are such that the money flows back to local communities.
Yeah.
In general, there's a couple other like key points that tend to sort of define ecotourism, and I don't remember them offhand.
But basically, these are individuals who probably employ locals and who are fundamentally interested in combining the income that comes with tourism with sustainable ecology,
Right.
education.
And there's like an interpretive component. Like you can pay someone to take you to see some, lions in Africa, right? But that doesn't mean that it's ecotourism.
Absolutely. Like you want to make sure that you're going with people who are upstanding, who care a lot, who
Right.
are
And frankly,
sanctioned by the
and
government.
who won't lie to you.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's very, very easy to go to South Africa and have someone convince you that, by cuddling with these baby lions, you're helping lion conservation because you paid your $20 entrance or whatever. And that's simply a lie.
Yeah.
That is never true. If you're ever allowed to touch an animal,
Yeah.
but that's not all consumers, even those who have the best of intentions, have the like expertise to identify what is reasonable and what is not.
But bugs are okay, right? Because those are animals.
Bugs
and
are-
I like touching bugs.
I mean, look,
Some bugs are okay.
yeah, I never like. I don't want to encourage people to go out and touch animals of any kind.
Uh-huh.
Because even even a bug you can like disturb.
Yeah.
But
if
if you are with someone who knows what they're
Yeah.
doing, like if you're with an entomologist, a wildlife biologist, a proper ecotourism guide, that doesn't mean that there aren't animals that you can touch.
So on this first trip that you guys are offering, it's to the Amazon, right?
So we partnered with Atlas Obscura, which has recently started offering like international trips, international travel. And we came to them. We were like, we want to work together. We want to offer like solid ecotourism, wildlife based trips to their audience. So in April, we're going to the Amazon to the Peruvian Amazon for a week. I think if there are people listening who want to come, I think you still might be able to get under the wire.
Oh,
we
really?
still have, I think, a couple of spots.
Cool. So if you could just go to Atlas Obscura, you can find their travel
Yeah,
section.
find the international travel section and find Expedition Amazon is the name of the trip.
Cool.
But we'll certainly we don't have any more planned, like scheduled, but we plan
Yeah.
on doing more trips like this, and we'll go to Peru again, but we'll also go to some other places.
And so this is like a guided week-long trip where not only do you get to enjoy yourselves, but you get to do it in a safe way. You get to do it in an educational way. There's entomologists, there's researchers along for the ride to kind of teach
Right.
you, so you're not just on your own.
Right, you'll like we'll be in Peru, and we'll have our guides, from the lodges, but then we'll Phil and I will also be there, and this is we for the first trip we're doing like this, we chose a place we've both been to before many times and have reported from, and there's lots of good research happening and good stories to tell. And
Do they get to put a spider on their face?
well, it's actually a amphipygid.
It's not a spider.
It is called a tailless whip scorpion. It is also not a scorpion.
It's not even an
amphipygid.
arachnid?
It's an arachnid.
Oh, it is. Okay.
It is not a spider or scorpion.
Interesting.
It's an amphipygid.
They're really big and really scary looking, but totally
Yes.
fine and safe, right?
Yes. They're super creepy. Totally harmless. And yes, jungle initiation is putting an amphipygid on your face.
I love it. Yeah, I've seen the photos, both of you and Phil, and also some of our friends who have been down to visit. And I really want to go. I can't go on this trip, but I'm hoping to be able to go soon.
Yeah.
And anybody listening, if there's a chance you could still slip in to go on this trip. Like he said, if not, there will be more in the future. All right, I think it is time to say goodbye. Why don't you let everybody, Jason, know where they can find you on Tay Interwebs, and also where they can find your kind of more recent work.
Sure. You can. So, I've been really bad at keeping my website updated with my recent work. Like it's at least a year out of date.
Jason.
But I know. I just need to pay someone to do it because I don't want to do it myself. But in general, I write for Scientific American, the BBC, KCET here in LA, LA Magazine, Biographic, places like that.
And you're super active on Twitter.
But in general, Twitter, on Twitter and on Instagram, I'm jgold85. On Facebook, I'm facebook.com/jason.goldman.
Okay, cool. So people can reach out. They can say hi. If they follow you, you'll be obviously updating people on what's going on, and they
And
can
if they
want
to come to the Amazon, they can reach out to me in social as well.
Very cool. All right. Well, Jason, thank you so much for being here. This was a fun chat.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and we'll do 4Zs soon.
Great.
All right, and everybody listening, thank you so much for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.